So we are doing part 2 of our stock market episode, taking a look now a little bit more towards how the stock market can be exploited or manipulated, or maybe not always be the fair system to determine the value of businesses and investing. So, Jordan, we had already talked about just the different ways that you can invest. So things like stocks and bonds and commodities. You can purchase them as individual stocks, mutual funds, ETFs, options. So lots of different nuances. Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was just like, options.
Yeah, right.
It's a silly term, I find, but
yeah. Lots of different ways to kind of participate in the stock market, right? But because there's so many different ways, and because there's like even so many different things that you can invest in, there's a wide variety, I guess, of ways that the stock market isn't exactly as clear as it's trying to present itself as, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully, as we go on with this episode, that's going to come a little bit clearer. But with that being said, and I might kind of jump around here, so I do apologize if the episode ends up being a little bit all over the place. But nevertheless, taking a look at, just for starters, who generally can exploit the stock market, right? There's an argument to be said that anyone, to a degree, could exploit the stock market. That's kind of like a lot of systems.
If you spend enough time, it's like your hobby. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
you're going to eventually find loopholes.
Well, and that's just it, right? Like, so not to go down this rabbit hole, but a lot of the systems that we've even talked about previously, right? It's not that only certain people are allowed to kind of take advantage of different things, right? Whether it be like taxes, let's say, right? At the end of the day, the same opportunities are available to everyone, but the reality is that there are only certain people in society that are really able to take advantage of it, right? I feel like taxes is always a really good example of that, where we're all eligible for the same taxes.
Yeah,
same
but business owners
policies.
have an edge against everybody else, right?
Yeah,
because
right?
they can write off way more than the average person. So
Definitely, right? And then it scales from there, right? Big businesses versus a mom and pop shop, right?
yeah,
And the stock market, right, investing in publicly traded businesses is really the same kind of thing, right? And so with that being said, I think you can kind of summarize it of who gets to exploit the stock market can be broken down into two categories, but you can argue that they're kind of interchangeable in some ways. And that's really people with knowledge and people with financial superiority, right?
Yeah.
Meaning that you have a lot of money or you know a lot of things.
Yeah, that's pretty much it's gonna fall into one of those two categories, pretty much.
Yeah. And in some cases, you're going to have overlap, right? You're going to have someone that knows
business owner with inside information.
Yeah, that knows a lot and has a lot of money, right? And so, I kind of looked at it, like I was trying to, like ahead of time for this episode, trying to think of what general kind of areas that I want to focus on in that sense. And I really came up with 3 in particular. I'm sure you could probably think of another category or a subcategory that's connected with these, about people in society or groups in society that are able to just benefit a little bit extra from things like the stock market. But with that being said, I really broke it down into ETFs, right?
Yeah.
Big businesses that like either have their own ETFs. You could, I guess, include to a degree some mutual funds, but any kind of like investment portfolio that is a large scale portfolio. And in particular, I wanted to focus on ETFs because they're kind of seen as the like democratization of the stock market, in the sense that you don't need to know a lot. You can just kind of park your money over here, it's going to give you a basket of goods, or sorry, a basket of businesses that you're going to have a piece of, and it kind of evens out the market, right?
Yeah.
So if it's an ETF, we talked about last time, an ETF that covers the S&P 500, right? So you're covered with, hey, I have a percentage of all of those 500 companies, right? That is great, and it allows for most people, right? Warren Buffett would be the first to say that most people should just invest in an index like the S&P 500, because who has the time to pick an individual stock? But with that being said, similar to kind of mutual funds in that way, when you're putting all of this money into an ETF, that's when you hear about kind of your BlackRocks, your Vanguards, your whatever, right? Go down the list of these massive businesses who have created their own ETFs, which is amazing, but we all give our money towards it. And then that's where you get the little sentiment of like BlackRock owns the world, right?
Yeah.
Well, BlackRock owns the world because we all gave money to BlackRock to buy all of these businesses for us, right?
Yeah.
And we're gonna, again, we can go down the rabbit hole with those a little bit further, but just for argument's sake, to name off all of the different things that groups or people that are able to benefit from the stock market. So we talked about ETFs there. Politicians are another one, right? Politicians, obviously, more so I would make the argument of the knowledge side of things.
Correct.
But
yeah.
with that being said, you make a pretty good penny depending on what your job is.
In the government.
Yeah, right? Like you can, even in Canada, like I feel like I'd have to look it up to be honest with you. But I know like a lot of like congressmen and senators in the States are making essentially like $200,000, right?
Yeah.
And so
Which
a lot of people, that's a lot
of
money,
is
right?
to entice them away from corruption, but usually doesn't work.
Yeah, 100%, right? Yeah. That's such a good point. I don't know. Do you want to elaborate on that general aspect?
Well, without trying to like go down a different route here, it's just
Yep.
Well, in terms of the politicians, you pay them enough so that they don't get. It's not easier to. It shouldn't be, at least in theory, to bribe them in a sense, right? So.
Yeah. So it's the idea that politicians, in particular, are privy to a lot of information and have a lot of power in their decision making.
Yeah.
Right. And so you pay them a reasonable enough wage so that it's supposed to disincentivize them from wanting to exploit that power and knowledge that they have, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And so, yeah, politicians, right? They 100% fall under that category. And then the last one, kind of similar, I guess you could almost make the argument that it's the combination of the ETFs and the politicians out there, is super investors. So I've already mentioned Warren Buffett, right? But you can go down the list of many super investors that exist in our world. And I'm not trying to say that automatically that Warren Buffett is the one exploiting it, but most people know that household name, right?
Yeah.
And it's just really that idea that, again, super investors have a ton of money at their disposal.
Yeah, they can really get in ahead of everybody else in terms of like how much they can buy, right? So which then in turn drives the price of the stock up. So
yeah, I'm glad you even went there. So, well, yeah, like I don't know if you want, we can go off of that, right? So, when you have, well, let's just stick with the super investor side of things. You can make the argument that the ETFs and politicians also can benefit from this, but when you have a super investor, they have the ability to either pump a stock up or crash a stock,
yeah,
right? Depending on how much that they have invested or are willing to invest, you can completely, it's that analogy of like a whale, right? Like within the stock market, they're able to create massive waves from either their buying or selling of a certain investment, right?
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't go as far as saying that that's always going to be a manipulation factor, right? It might not be done I should say, out of
Malice.
like an intent for that, malice or an intent for manipulation. But the reality is that when you have one person or essentially one entity, like one group, making a decision that is going to actively affect the outcome of an investment that maybe you or I have a small
Portion.
portion of an investment
which is
in.
usually the case for most people. So
Yeah, 100%, right? If if all of a sudden a Warren Buffett or someone like that has a massive investment in, let's say, a company like Apple, and they're like, okay, we don't want anything to do with Apple anymore, and so they sell their whole stake in it. Well, that can be a huge drop in the value of that company. Now, there's lots of things that go into that, but the aspect that there are technically people out there or groups out there that can somewhat, whether they do this or not, hold different businesses like hostage in a sense, where you're kind of at the mercy of this super investor to be able to say, like, if I keep you happy, like, please don't sell the stock type of thing, right?
Yeah.
Or if I incentivize that super investor, be like, oh, look it, like, we have lots of benefits over here. You could pump up the stock really quickly by buying a lot in that, not only from the purchasing fact, but there's a lot of people that follow super investors closely, right? So I might hear like a Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or whoever, and say to myself, oh, maybe I'll actually buy those same investments, right? So their influence is another thing, right? And that kind of goes back to the knowledge aspect. So hopefully you can kind of get a bit of a sense, right? We got the like ETFs as being this large money fund, right? So like a BlackRock type of business. We buy an ETF that is from BlackRock. They technically are the ones that are going to physically own the stocks that are a part of that ETF or that index, right?
Yeah.
And then, but they're doing it with our money, right? And then, technical difficulties. I can pause. Let's get back into this. All right, technical difficulties over with. Let's break things back here. So, I have no idea, depending on how this is being cut. Just to recap, right? We got our ETFs, we got our politicians, we got our super investors. They are kind of our major categories, I guess, of groups that can have massive influence on the stock market, right?
Yeah.
And you can kind of really summarize, I would make the argument of all three, but or kind of part of it for all three. Everything good?
Yep.
Oh, okay. No, I thought you were like, oh. thought we lost it again. But yeah, you can make an argument that for all three of these, right, they can kind of be summarized in either the fact that their ability to time the market, especially you see in the cases like politicians, that's pretty big that we've been hearing in the news and stuff like that. Not going to automatically name names, but you can insert
it's pretty
names
obvious.
here, right? Yeah.
Should be at least, yeah.
People who have 10x'd their money type of thing, given the privileges that they have on the different committees and stuff along those lines, right? The privileged information. So they're able to purchase some investments in different ways, shapes, and forms for them to time the market, right? A little bit too lucky for something that's supposed to be somewhat random at times.
Too much of a coincidence kind of thing,
And then the other aspect, which again we've already said, is their ability to deploy capital, which allows for essentially like a push force within a stock, right? It can like push things up or pull things down, depending on what their intention is, right?
Intention is, yeah.
The other kind of aspect of all this, right, is not so much always an exploitation, I guess. It's a little bit more towards like the manipulation of things, right? And you kind of already talked about it because there is some version of this within the like kind of super investors and ETFs and even politicians, I guess. But it's the fact that we can buy things like stocks on margin, right? And we had mentioned, or I'd mentioned that in the last episode. You have these things called margin accounts, and margin accounts allow you to buy stocks on credit, right? You take a loan out essentially.
Yeah. Pay it later kind of thing.
Yeah, so you might only have 10% of the like money, so to speak, in your account to be able to buy another 90% worth of a certain stock or multiple stocks, right? But that's not money that you actually had in the moment, right?
Correct, yeah.
And so what that...
loan.
Sorry, what's that?
It's on loan, basically.
Yeah. So similar to, we talked about the housing market, right? If I want to buy a house, I'm buying it on a mortgage. It's not that I actually own 100% to pay for that house in that moment. I maybe am only covering 20%, and then the other 80% is covered by the bank, in which case I still get the house at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
And so in margin accounts, and this idea of buying stocks on credit, right? It does have a huge effect on the market, as you can probably imagine, right? And it's very similar, I guess, to the housing market that we did talk about.
Similar.
Yeah, where just like houses over the years, because of mortgages, have become more expensive, right? Because people are able to put more money down, or like more money into the house, because they don't actually have to physically have that money. The stocks work the same way, where you can, maybe I actually only have a certain amount of demand that I could legitimately afford of a certain stock, right? But instead of, I don't know, right? All depends on the numbers here, but let's say I only actually have the money for 5 stocks, but instead I can go on margin and buy 50 stocks of that same stock, right? Yeah. So I've essentially created artificial demand. I'm not saying that I didn't want those stocks, right? But if people didn't have the money, let's say, to actually afford those stocks in the first place, well, it's not going to create this artificial demand, which, as we know, with the aspect of supply and demand when it comes to the stock market,
it's its own form of inflation.
Yeah, right? Exactly. So it means that I can drive up the price of a certain stock because I can buy it with money that I don't have at the moment. And then if someone else wants to come along and buy that same stock, well, now they're buying it at a way different price than had I only bought those 5 stocks, right? Again, confusing scenario or situation, but hopefully that makes sense to people, right? This idea that if people are able to buy more than they actually can truly afford, anything in society, right? I could buy a Ski-Doo if I
put it on credit.
Put it on credit, right? Well, like that's demand that was not actually naturally there. Based off of what the market says that like cash available, right?
Yeah.
So of course, right? Yeah, we kind of, the gist of it is it makes everything more expensive. And so that's why I say it's a little bit more of a manipulation than it is so much of an exploitation.
Honest. Yeah, you're kind of like bending the rules in your like favor because of the ability of the extra capital to do that. So it's, right.
And it is, again, kind of that same notion of it's not something that you're actively trying to do from like a malicious standpoint of like, oh, let me drive this stock price up, right? Let's say.
Yeah, you just want your goods to be, or you want like what you're investing in to be successful in that sense, right? So.
Sure, but also more importantly, like if I want to use a margin account, or if you're a listener here, and you use margin in your stock portfolio, Well, all that is just trying to leverage the credit system. That you're going to be like, hey, I really like this stock A over here,
Yeah,
and
I can't buy. I can only buy this much, but I want to invest this much.
Exactly. I think that it's a good bet. I'm going to put more money into it that I don't have necessarily. I'm going to take a bet that this is going to pay off. That I'm going to be able to pay back my my loan, so to speak. But yeah, you're not doing it to be like, okay, because if that was the case, then people would just take out crazy amounts of margins and just like, oh, look, I like increased the stock price because I bought hundreds of thousands of dollars or billions of dollars worth of this one stock to like drive the price up. But it really isn't used that way. But when everyone like or lots of people start to use margin, you are taking there's only so much supply, right? So if you're creating artificial demand, it's going to create that state of inflation to drive that.
Keep everything in, yeah.
Yeah. And oftentimes, not to go down this road necessarily, but margin and the idea of the amount of like credit within the stock market is often a telltale sign with like a bubble, right? Like again, I believe we've talked about it. I apologize if we have not, but for instance, the like Great Depression, right? The Great Depression was a situation where there was a lot of leverage within the market, meaning a lot of credit, like using margin accounts, within the stock market. So it wasn't that all of these people were invested with their own money. It was that, hey, maybe it's only, I don't know, 30% of the amount of money in the total stock market was actual money people had to pay in cash, so to speak, and whereas the other 70% is all on this like inflated, fictitious, numbers and zeros on a spreadsheet type of situation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So like, and as we know, right, we've talked about the creation of money and all that stuff, so we know that is considered money. But the reality is what is it backed by when you're kind of almost getting an advancement on your paycheck without actually potentially working, right? Yeah. Like there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to recoup the funds to pay it back, right?
Yeah, and then you have a serious problem if that stock gets pulled out of, right? Because then it's
100%, right?
That's what we talked about in the Depression.
Yeah, and I think even the last episode, because we did talk about margin counts, but like margin calls, where you invested in such stock that's not doing so well, and hey, you used a lot of leverage to do it, so we're actually going to have a margin call where you have to pay us all back the money that you loaned out. So find a way, because you're not going to necessarily get it from the stock that you bought, because the stock has probably gone down, hence why you have a margin call, right? When stocks are going up, no one seems to care about the amount of credit in the stock market
that's available.
It's only when things start to go down that you realize, oh my goodness, we don't actually have the money to be able to do these things, right? To purchase these stocks in the first place. So yeah, it's a very like risky business, so to speak, when you're looking at things like margin. But that goes on a whole other level when you also have politicians, super investors, massive like brokerages and ETF fund managers that are able to take even their large sums of money and then have leverage on top of that, right? So a big one in particular is politicians tend to do a lot of things on leverage, right? On margin. And I mean, not to fully accuse here, but the reason why they're able to do that is they're pretty confident that they're going to get a solid return on that investment.
Because, as we were saying earlier, they have information on or people aren't privy to, right? So.
Yeah. And the reason why I should say that, like a lot of people think of insider trading, right? Where you're maybe in a business and you are aware of something. Let's say you this is maybe a random example, but Microsoft, right, when they were going to buy Activision, right?
Yeah.
So if, let's say someone with high up in Microsoft's company who's a part of that deal, like that conversation with Activision to purchase them, was like, ooh, I'm going to buy some of these Activision stocks, right? Because I know that the value of it, once this deal kind of goes through, is going to go up.
Yeah.
Right. So that would be kind of like an insider trading where it's like, okay, I'm going to do something based off of my business, and then benefit from it. The difference with that is that's illegal.
Yeah.
It is 100% illegal. If you get caught doing those things, you will be punished. The others,
in all sense, it's cheating, right? So
yeah, right, yeah. But the funny part is that there's a lot of argument that whether it be these politicians or even a massive hedge fund or like a Vanguard and BlackRock, right? Like these ETF companies or even these super investors, have ways of doing the exact same thing, right? Maybe you're privy to some knowledge that you're going to be like, okay, I'm going to go and purchase this, right? Like actually a prime example, I think Warren Buffett, who is very close with Bill Gates, bought Activision stocks when there was some conversation around, right? Yeah. Now there was things rumored on the internet kind of leading up to it that was a potential thing. So you can make an argument that it was just hey, hedge and a bet.
Public knowledge, yeah.
If at the time Activision was looking also like from an evaluation standpoint pretty cheap, all things considered. So there's lots of reasons why you might buy it, but it's hard to say that someone who's friends with Bill Gates may not have found out some information on that sense, right?
Yeah.
Same with politicians, right?
Like, and that's where you get the overlap, right? Like with the two categories. Mm-hmm. And usually that's how it happens. Like it's usually if you're just being manipulated and like trying to be exploited, it's because you have information and the capital to exploit it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because if you have all the knowledge in the world, you either are selling that knowledge, right? Or you need to have the money yourself to kind of act on that knowledge, right? And that's why even a lot of these politicians, it's not necessarily that it's them purchasing these things. Sometimes it's a spouse that purchases those stocks, right?
So it doesn't look as incriminating, but it's obviously they're gonna talk. So.
Yeah, right. It's hard to be like, how were you that? Like, who would have thought that Braden and Jordan would have gotten that government contract, right? Like, I think only someone who sat on that committee would know that their business. Known. Yeah, right. And so on and so forth. And you see that all the time. Like government is probably one of the biggest ones where it's blatantly obvious, or at least to a lot of us, it feels blatantly obvious that, oh, you are going to give a special incentive towards this. Well, I wonder why, right? Because you're invested in that, or vice versa. You're gonna start investing in a company because you know that you're going to do incentives or government contracts over here, right? So as a whole, right, you see with the margin stuff, it makes things a lot more expensive. And we know that the knowledge of things and the amount of capital that you have, that is going to make a huge advantage for anyone who's in those positions, right?
Yeah.
The only other kind of thing, and like I recognize this might be a little bit more of a shorter episode, right? But the only other thing that I kind of wanted to touch upon is just how stocks are valued, right? And I don't know if we fully touched upon this in the first, like part 1 of our stock market episode, but nevertheless, right? There are lots of ways that you can evaluate a stock, right? You can look at their earnings, you can look at free cash flow, you can look at maybe the physical assets that they have, right? Like I don't know,
Yeah.
your Amazon, you got warehouses, right? That those warehouse spaces are worth things, right? Regardless if someone's buying a product from Amazon. So
Yeah.
there's lots of different ways to evaluate things, right? But hopefully, like, people are realizing that when it comes to the stock market, for the most part, it is completely random in terms of how things are going to be evaluated, right? That's the reason why you can have a stock, or actually, that's the reason why you have many stocks being evaluated at high multiples relative to what they are producing, right? And I think actually
Correct,
we talked about in the last episode.
Yes. Yeah.
That you can have I mean, obviously the big one in the news right now has been Nvidia, right? All the AI craze and cryptocurrency stuff, right? That's driving that market, and they've been doing really well. They've been making lots of money, but the reality is you are paying a multiple higher for the stock relative to what they're able to produce. Given that you're hopeful that their rate of expansion in terms of growth
is the same.
Is
like
is going to
pace.
same or increase or right. And so you have a situation where when it comes to the stock market as a whole, you really need to be looking more. Like, I mean, obviously, looking at a company in itself is important, but it's almost more important to understand who's doing the actual investing, right, in that market and what impact they have. So, right, we talked about like the like super investor aspect, right? If they are investing in certain stocks, well, you know that regardless of how those businesses do, technically speaking, the wills and whims of those super investors are going to have huge impacts on what that
stock.
Yeah, right. That makes sense, right? Like.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, and that goes. You can go down the line of from like the biggest fish in the pond, right, to right down to the smallest, right. You have people who will invest in a stock simply because a buddy told them about it, right? Like, you have other people who do crazy analysis of things, and they're going to invest in another stock because of it. But the idea that you are automatically going to come out on top, technically speaking, is like there's nothing that says that would be the case within the stock market, which is very different. And this is why I'm almost having this conversation about the stock market and how things are valued. It's very different than what I think most people think about the stock market. They think that if I have a good company, right, whatever, I don't know, Apple, right, that always, if I buy that, I know it's a good company and all these things, that it should just keep chugging up and up and up and up, and I'm going to make money on it, right? That can be the case, right? Especially for a company like an Apple that is very established. It's going to take a lot to knock them off, but at the same rate, you can have a situation where, I don't know, they put out a bad iPhone and then the like stock tanks, right?
Yeah.
Or at least temporarily, but that might not be from an evaluation standpoint of the business, right?
It just could be from the way people are investing in it. Or
Yeah. And not to kind of keep going back to this, but it's very similar in some ways to like the housing market, right? If you can have artificial demand, right, something that really shouldn't be as valuable as it's saying it is, people are buying it, versus you also might have the flip side where you have this beautiful house, but people are like, there's no demand for it, so it's selling well under asking.
Yeah, maybe it's in a bad spot or something.
Yeah. And stocks work the exact same way, right? Like, again, not to turn this into a finance channel and conversation, but if you're invested in overseas in like the Chinese market, well, right now there's some great companies that exist, but they are doing horribly because of the fact from the like political climate when it comes to things with China. right? Or you can go again with Russia, right, or wherever around the world, and you can have the exact reverse of that, where you have a lot of maybe I don't know, maybe you really believe in the United States, and so you're going to invest in some of those businesses that maybe on paper don't actually have much to show for their evaluation, because their growth has stagnated, or their earnings are not as high, right?
They're still starting up or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, right. So there's so many different things, but because it all comes back to really like supply and demand, you can, in any environment that runs on supply and demand, manipulate that, either that supply or that demand, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, we haven't even really talked about it, but there's things like stock splits that happen, which is where, let's say, you had a company that was 100 stocks. Now you're essentially making it like, okay, now that there's a total of 1,000 stocks, but so if you owned one of those stocks, now you have 10 stocks instead of that one, right?
Yeah.
But you can also have a very similar situation, but it's actually a dilution of stocks where they're adding more shares, right? So it's not a stock
to
split.
water it down.
Yeah. So instead of having those 100 shares going to 1,000 shares, it's not that your stock, went up. It's that now there's just more available for people to buy. In which case, your stock now lost in that case, right? Like 10%, right?
Yeah.
Or no, what was that? I don't know. yeah, 10%.
Some kind of value.
Yeah, no, 10%, going from 100 to 1,000. Yeah.
1,000.
Yeah. So right, like you're going to lose on the valuation of, or sorry, you're only going to have 10% of value, I should say. At the end of the day, it would never go that extreme, but that happens all the time with stocks, right? That the way that people can change the value of things, right? Even a business owner, right? The CEO of a company can choose to buy back some of their shares, right? Normally, that's seen as a really good thing, right? It's seen that the company has a lot of faith in their business. Maybe they feel that their business is undervalued, right? But it also very often does happen where, let's say, a stock isn't doing too well, and maybe it's even justified as to why it's not doing well. But in order to appease some of the shareholders, the company will buy back some of those stocks, right? And then it's like, okay, so we've mitigated some of your losses, or maybe we even bumped it up so that now you get a bit of a return in a year that you probably should have had a loss, right?
Yeah.
All of those many different factors, right? I know I'm like kind of rambling all over the place, but all of those different things that play into it is why that the stock market in itself is not as transparent as it really would like to be, right? Anyone who has a company that's on the stock market has to show all of their kind of numbers, right? Oh, now you lost it. I think we were, like you said, Jordan, we were talking about the overall value of things, and how things can kind of be a little bit manipulated, kind of tweaked. I think potentially the last thing that might have gotten cut out was when I was talking about, like, you had said, or we had talked about like stock splits, or like a CEO buying back shares of a company to boost the value or boost the price of that company, right? To mitigate maybe some of the losses, to give back a bit to the shareholders that have been loyal and stayed with it, type of thing. And again, not all those reasons are ultimately negative, right? Like if for some reason the Mr. Market type of thing is devaluing a certain business, even though it really has no reason to, right? Almost the equivalent of not that I want to go down this road, but like Tesla lost a lot of money when Elon got in trouble for being on Joe Rogan's podcast, right? For one thing or another. But that had nothing to do with the business, ultimately. It may have to do with what you feel leadership's ability to make decisions. But at the end of the day, the amount of cars that were being sold and all of this stuff, right? Like the numbers of things didn't change, right? So there's so many different ways, like in whims of individuals or big groups, that really make the stock market not as transparent as it kind of would like to present itself as. It's this idea that we put a lot of faith, and we talked about this in the first episode. Most people, if you're going to make some investment, besides maybe an investment in yourself or like a business, most people find they're like, how do I make money? Oh, I put it into the stock market, right? I'm going to place a bet, so to speak, on one business or another, and then hope that pays out. And we put a lot of faith in that, but the reality is, you can be the greatest investor, like a Warren Buffett, right? And still lose, right?
Yeah, you never know.
He doesn't win every single one of his bets, right?
Yeah. It's the risk of gambling.
Yeah, and that's, I think, I'm glad you said it like that, because I don't think people look at the stock market as gambling. Right, it's not.
Oh, it is.
It's not like you and I doing Proline trying to make some sports bets.
But it is in its own way.
100%, right? Because of the fact that there is nothing systematically controlling it. Like when a company is doing well, it is automatically going to go up, and when a company is doing poorly, it's going to go down. Like there's nothing clear cut about that. Because there's so many different ways to purchase stocks. There's so much information out there about different businesses. There's so many different opinions that you're feeling in the moment, right? You could have an opinion, like we said with the like Elon Musk stuff and Tesla, something that has nothing to do with the business at its core, may be a reason why people either start investing into something or divest into it, right? Or out of it, I should say. Right? Like, so it is one of those cornerstone institutions within our societies, right? Especially within capitalist societies, right? That we put so much faith in. But like many of the things we talk about on this channel, in this series of Powerview,
it's only good as long as people believe in it.
Yeah, right? Only as good as people believe in it, but even that, like, because I would say that belief in the stock market, unlike maybe, I don't know, democracies or government, like, belief in the stock market is pretty much at an all-time high, as much as it always is, right? Even when the stock market fails, I think people still have a lot of faith in the stock market. That's the crazy part, is that there is so much faith and an abundance of faith because it's the closest thing in some ways to this aspect of the lottery, right? Where it's like, how can I get rich? Well, you do it in the stock market, right? I'll be the next Wolf of Wall Street, right?
Exactly.
Or even just this idea of like, hey, I'm just like a mom and pop, and I want to retire one day. I'm gonna put my money into a mutual fund and hope it grows enough that I can pay for my expenses in retirement, right? Whatever you fall on that spectrum. It's all this, hey, let me put my money into this system, my wealth, my retirement, and hope that I've made the right decisions at the right time. And that there aren't going to be others who will tank that, whether it be political reasons, whether it be massive investors. Maybe it's also this aspect of you buy an ETF, well, like, you don't actually own any of those companies, right? But I would be the first to tell people from an investment standpoint, and this is not financial advice, I am not a financial advisor, but most people, you would say, buy an ETF, right? Buy an index fund. But there is implications, like it's great if you're the one who owns that index fund or that ETF, because at the end of the day, you own those stocks, right? Because you're just using other people's money. And sure, you might have to sell here and there, but I don't own the S&P 500. I own an index fund that owns the S&P 500.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So kind of hopefully that gives like a bit of a gist. And I know I ripped through this relatively quick. There's a lot more that is rattling around my brain that we could talk
one
about.
Of those things, though, that's kind of obvious, right? Like it's
well, it should be obvious, but I know that it's not necessarily, right? Like
necessarily, no.
That's why it's a billion-trillion-dollar industry, right?
No, but when you break it down into the knowledge versus the capital part of it, and then when you look at it,
you're like, oh yeah, of course you could exploit it that way, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It'd be like playing Monopoly with extra information or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you get an extra $50 or something.
Yeah, right. No more money, and in a year that house or that property over there is going to go
on that one exactly. Yeah, the right time.
Yeah,
that's not a coincidence.
Yeah, right? Something like that. But hopefully, like I said, hopefully that makes sense. I appreciate Jordan you saying that it makes sense. So, because I know sometimes I can get rambling with all these things. But yeah, Jordan, I don't know. Was there any questions or anything or comments that you wanted to pipe in?
No, I think the NVIDIA was a good example.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
Because that one's all over the place right now. So
yeah, it's like a stock that's just climbed up exponentially, right?
And you hear stories like that every once in a while, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's even a funny one in some ways because NVIDIA had a massive climb just recently because of its earnings. But literally, I think it was the day before or 2 days before earnings calls happened for NVIDIA, there was some inkling that they weren't going to meet their estimates. And so the stock, relative to the stock, it did tank. It dropped it was double-digit percentages in a day, which is a lot for a stock. Or I should say a lot for a stock of that size, right? We're not talking about a penny stock type of thing. And so, that alone, right? People got scared. They're like, oh gosh, maybe they're not going to make their earnings, and they sold out. Well, that automatically then, if you bought on that day, you're buying stock valued at something that's arbitrary at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because that stock should have been worth even more than that, right? But you could also make an argument that it wasn't worth any of that in the first place. Right? Because who knows what AI will be? Who knows what other companies are going to put investments into AI?
But
right?
I think I think if you look at those two categories, and then you look at it on your own separately, it's easy to see.
Yes.
Where
who and what can be exploited.
And that's really what we're trying to get across. So
yeah, most definitely. All right.
Yes, sir.
With that being said, I'm Braden. He's Jordan. Together we are the Realist Idealists. And this is Powerview.